Hey everyone, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
We're kicking off today with a really bold question, maybe even a provocative one.
Oh, yeah.
What if the year 1913 wasn't just some date in a history book, but maybe the single biggest turning point away from American freedom?
Wow. Okay. That's a strong premise.
It is. We're diving deep into a book that argues exactly that. It suggests that nearly every modern political and economic headache we deal with.
Things like high taxes, massive national debt, all that stuff.
Exactly. That it all stems from four specific, kind of catastrophic changes that happened around 112 years ago.
Right. We're talking about Oliver DeMille's book, 1913. It came out in July 2012.
And it's important to frame what kind of book this is, isn't it? It's not quite your standard history text.
No, definitely not. It's probably better classified as an ideological treatise
Ooh.
or maybe a popular polemic. It lays out a historical narrative, but for a very specific political viewpoint.
A viewpoint centered on this idea that a limited sort of Jeffersonian government model.
Was systematically taken apart and replaced by a much more centralized Wilsonian model. That's the core thesis.
And we should mention, if you're curious about the book itself, there's an Amazon link down in the description.
Good point. Now, this book has definitely found its audience.
Oh, absolutely. It gets called things like a masterpiece on freedom,
Yeah.
required reading by its supporters.
And that's reflected in the ratings, right? Like on Goodreads, it holds a pretty high score. What was it?
Yeah, something like 4.26 out of 5 stars.
Yeah.
It clearly resonates. I think part of its appeal is how it frames history as this secret history.
Like something the mainstream institutions, the academics, are ignoring.
Precisely. But then from that scholarly perspective,
Yeah.
well, there's another side.
Right. It's been criticized as, let's say, overly simplified or superficial, and you basically won't find it reviewed in any peer-reviewed academic journals. It just doesn't engage much with modern academic history writing.
So it's polarizing.
Ah.
And that's exactly why we're unpacking it today. Our mission is to give you the full dossier.
The full picture. We'll look at its historical context. That's part one.
Then its central arguments, the 4 big changes. That's part 2.
How it uses historical figures, almost like characters in a play, part three.
We'll touch on its structure in part 4, how it's put together.
Its reception, who loves it, who critiques it, part five.
And crucially, the strongest counter-arguments from that mainstream historical perspective we mentioned. That'll be part 6.
Okay, so let's start with that context. Part one, the ideological background. Where's DeMille coming from?
Well, his background is interesting. He's known for founding the Thomas Jefferson Education Movement, or TJE. It's a non-traditional approach focusing on classics and self-directed learning.
And that connects to his intellectual lineage too, right? He was mentored by W. Cleon Skousen, a very prominent conservative author.
Yeah, and that Skousen influence is key. It tends to frame the U.S. Constitution as this, well, almost divinely inspired document.
One that's constantly under threat from corruption or misinterpretation.
Exactly. And that framing sets up the book's core conflict, this big ideological battle.
The archetype war, as the outline calls it, Jeffersonianism versus Wilsonianism.
Limited government, sound money, states' rights. That's the Jeffersonian ideal in the book.
Versus the Wilsonian or progressive model. Centralized power, federal intervention, more flexibility with money. DeMille frames it almost like a hostile takeover.
And the timing of the book's release, 2012, that wasn't accidental, was it?
Probably not. Think about 2012. America was still feeling the effects of the 2008 recession. Public debt was a huge topic.
The Tea Party movement was really prominent then, demanding fiscal limits on government.
Right, and this book provided a historical narrative that seemed to explain why things felt out of control. It offered a clear story that validated those anxieties. It landed right in the middle of a very polarized election year.
Which helps explain why it presents historical figures in such stark terms. They become archetypes.
The Founding Fathers are sort of this unified chorus of wise, almost prophetic figures. Their writings are treated a bit like scripture.
And Woodrow Wilson. He's positioned as the main antagonist, the intellectual force behind this negative turning point.
While someone like Calvin Coolidge is portrayed as maybe a heroic but ultimately tragic figure, someone who saw the problem but couldn't stop the tide.
It sets up a very dramatic narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Let's get into the meat. Part 2. The 4 key arguments. DeMille's Pillars of Decline.
Right. His core claim is that these 4 specific events work together. They increase the government's desire to spend money.
Eliminated the traditional roadblocks that stopped massive spending.
And created easier ways to tax people and, crucially, to just print more money.
Okay, pillar number 1.
The 16th Amendment. the federal income tax.
Why was this so bad, according to DeMille?
Because it fundamentally flipped the power dynamic between Washington and the states. Before this, the federal government relied heavily on the states for revenue.
Ah, so the states held the purse strings, in a way. They had a natural check on federal spending.
That's the idea. Once Washington could tax incomes directly, it became financially independent. That key leverage point for the states just vanished.
He uses that analogy, right? The Scottish versus Irish models.
Yeah, he argues America went from a model where states provided a kind of protective buffer with indirect taxes, the Scottish model, to the Irish model of direct, potentially subjugating taxation, something he says the founders desperately wanted to avoid.
Okay, that's one. Pillar number 2.
The 17th Amendment. This is the one that established the direct election of senators by the people instead of by state legislatures.
How did that contribute to the decline, in his view?
Well, the original design, with state legislatures choosing senators, meant the Senate was supposed to represent the state's interests in Washington. It acted as a check on populist impulses from the House.
The voice of frugality, maybe. Protecting state sovereignty and keeping spending down.
Exactly. DeMille argues that making senators directly elected turned the Senate into just another version of the House, more responsive to popular demands, potentially less concerned with long-term fiscal health or states' rights. It removed a critical institutional break.
Makes sense within his framework. Okay, pillar 3.
The Federal Reserve Act, also around 1913.
Now, most people think the Fed was created for economic stability, right? To prevent bank runs.
That's the standard view. But DeMille sees it very differently. He sees it as giving the government a really dangerous power, the ability to create fiat money.
Meaning money not backed by gold or silver, just declared legal tender by the government.
Precisely. And his core criticism is that this power allows the government to finance its spending essentially by printing money, which leads to inflation.
And he views inflation as a kind of tax.
Yes, a hidden regressive tax. It hurts savers and the middle class the most, while he argues it benefits the wealthy aristocratic upper class, who might hold assets that inflate in value or are closer to the source of the new money.
He brings up that fascinating detail about the Coinage Act of 1792, doesn't he?
He does. The claim is it mandated the death penalty for anyone debasing the currency. Whether that's entirely accurate historically is debated, but he uses it to show how seriously he believes the founders took the idea of sound money.
Wow. Okay, 3 down. What's the 4th pillar? The final nail.
This one comes a bit later in 1936. The Supreme Court case, United States v. Butler.
How did a court case lock in this decline?
DeMille argues it did so by radically reinterpreting the Constitution's general welfare clause.
Wait, unpack that. Before Butler, the idea was that Congress could only spend money on things specifically listed in the Constitution, the enumerated powers.
Roughly, yes. There were about 20 specific areas listed where Congress was authorized to spend. The argument in 1913 is that Butler essentially untethered federal spending from those specific limits.
Giving Congress a virtual blank check, they could spend on almost anything, as long as they argued it was for the general welfare.
That's the claim, that it blew the doors off any meaningful constitutional limits on spending. And there's a striking statistic often cited in relation to this.
The one attributed to Justice O'Connor.
Right. That since the Butler decision, the Supreme Court has apparently never struck down an act of Congress simply because it exceeded the constitutional spending authority. 0 times.
Yeah, that does paint a picture of massively expanded federal power, doesn't it?
It certainly makes the argument seem compelling. It creates this very clear, dramatic narrative of a fall from grace, a deliberate dismantling of limits.
Okay, so that's DeMille's case. Powerful stuff. But like we said, it's a simplified narrative. Let's get into part 3. The balancing act, counter-arguments, and omissions. What does mainstream history say?
Well, the mainstream view is quite different. Historians generally see the progressive era reforms, including the income tax and direct election of senators, not as some elite conspiracy, but as popular responses to very real, very big problems in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right. Take the 16th Amendment, the income tax. DeMille sees a power grab, but historians see a push for fairness.
Exactly. The Gilded Age saw incredible wealth concentration, robber barons, monopolies, and the existing tax system, based heavily on tariffs and consumption taxes, hit poor people hardest.
So the income tax was seen as a way to make the system more progressive, to make the wealthy pay a fairer share.
That was the goal. It was a popular reform aimed at equity.
In the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. DeMille sees it weakening the states.
But the counter-argument is that it was a major democratic reform needed to fight corruption. State legislatures were often deadlocked for years trying to choose a senator.
And Senate seats were notoriously being bought by powerful corporate interests, right? The Senate was called the Millionaires Club for a reason.
Absolutely. Direct election was seen as a way to make senators more accountable to the people and less beholden to special interests or party bosses in smoke-filled rooms.
Okay, what about the Federal Reserve? DeMille sees instability and inflation fuel.
The mainstream view is almost the opposite. The U.S. economy before the Fed was plagued by frequent, devastating financial panics. 1893, 1907 were really bad ones. Banks failed, people lost savings.
So the Fed was created to provide stability, an elastic currency that could expand or contract as needed to prevent those crises.
That was the intention, to be a lender of last resort and smooth out the brutal boom and bust cycles.
And finally, U.S. v. Butler. DeMille calls it the final nail.
Well, that's a bit of a misreading, or at least an oversimplification. The court in Butler actually struck down the specific law in question, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, saying it did overreach.
Oh, so it wasn't a complete blank check then?
Not exactly in that case. While the court did affirm a broad interpretation of the spending power in Butler, a view that had been around for a while, actually it was really later New Deal cases that fully cemented the wide scope of federal regulatory and spending power we see today. Blaming Butler alone is too simple.
Okay, so the historical context suggests these changes were reactions to problems, not necessarily a plot to destroy freedom. That adds a lot of complexity.
It does. It shows how DeMille crafts his narrative by selecting certain facts and interpretations and omitting others.
Which leads us to an interesting disconnect in the book, mentioned in Part 4, the solutions. After diagnosing these huge systemic problems.
Constitutional amendments, federal banking system, Supreme Court doctrine. Massive stuff.
The solutions he proposes are, well, they're not political, are they?
Not really. They're very individualistic. This is the second half of the book, chapters 6 through 13, called The Solution, and it ties back directly to his T.J. Eade philosophy.
So what's the cure for these systemic ills?
It's basically a three-step plan for individual citizens. First, he emphasizes entrepreneurship, achieving financial independence so you're not reliant on the system.
Okay. Step 2.
Voracious reading and independent thinking. Self-education, basically. Diving into the classics, the founding documents, learning how to think critically outside of mainstream education.
And the third part.
He calls it tribal leadership. The idea is to build and lead small communities of like-minded people, focusing on local influence and creating alternatives, rather than trying to fix the big national institutions directly.
So the problems are systemic and political, but the solution is personal and educational.
Exactly. It reveals a core belief that real change doesn't come from fighting battles in Congress or the courts, but from individuals elevating themselves intellectually and morally, and then leading by example in their own spheres.
That's a fascinating approach, almost like saying the system is broken, so focus on building something better, smaller, yourself.
It's definitely a different kind of call to action than you might expect after the first half of the book.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. Part 5 was reception. We've touched on that. Highly rated by its niche audience, largely ignored or criticized by academia. And Part 6, the counter-arguments. We've covered those too.
We've tried to lay out the full story of 1913, both the powerful narrative it presents, which clearly resonates with many,
and the significant critiques from historians who see a more complex picture of the progressive era.
And really, this deep dive is just a starting point.
Absolutely. Regardless of whether you end up agreeing with DeMille's conclusions or not, the book itself is full of interesting details and arguments. It's definitely worth a read if this period of history or these ideas intrigue you.
Makes you think, for sure.
It does. So if you found this discussion thought-provoking, we'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel.
Yeah, it helps us keep doing these deep dives. Thanks for watching, everyone.
And please, share your thoughts or favorite moments from this discussion in the comments below. We genuinely read them and love the conversation. Comments and shares really help.
Okay, ready for that final provocative question?
Let's do it. It comes straight from DeMille's critique of the 17th Amendment.
Right, the direct election of senators.
He argues it made government worse by getting rid of that supposedly wise check from state legislatures. So here's the question for you to ponder.
Is it possible for a system that's less directly democratic to actually produce better outcomes sometimes? When, if ever, does more democracy potentially lead to negative results?
Something to think about. Until next time.